February of 2017.
Welcome, Roger Stone, author of the brand new book, The Making of the President 2016. This is your 5th book, but a really special one for you because you know the subject so well and have known him for decades. So I'm going to start with my first question. How do you think President Trump is doing?
I think he's doing fine in view of the fact that he's had no honeymoon, which has been pretty traditional for our presidents, no 2 or 3 weeks of goodwill from the other party. And that his election was such a shock to the political system. He's sticking to his agenda, which is the key thing. I think he's making progress on issues, and all these other contretemps about his Twitter feed and so on, I really think that's a sideshow that the voters not too interested in.
The Twitter feed, though, has become a big part of his presidency. The media focuses on it. It becomes a subject on talk shows. It's almost, as big a part of his presidency as when he takes to the podium. How do you consider that in the grand scheme of things in terms of his success as a president going forward? Do you think this will help him, could potentially hurt him? If you were on his staff, would you advise him to cool it on the Twitter, or do you think maybe it's a good thing?
It's his ability to communicate directly to the voters without the filter of the mainstream media or even the alternative media. So I think it's an extremely valuable tool. As he likes to say, it's like owning a newspaper without the debt. You can reach 16 million people in a flash. So I would urge him to keep tweeting because I think it is a valuable tool. The mainstream media gnashes their teeth about it because it allows him to communicate direct. I don't think they like that. They like to interpret. That said, I do think that he is going to be Donald Trump. He's not going to change. This whole idea that he is going to become more presidential, he's going to become more diplomatic. I don't think that's how he got elected. People like him because he's blunt, because he's genuine, because he's uncoached and unscripted. What you see is what you get. That's what we have elected.
But I will go back to referring to your book where you talk about your departure from the campaign, in part because you differed with strategy. It looked like you wanted a little bit more discipline, maybe a little less of Trump being Trump and more campaign discipline. How does that how do you take that and square it with your view now? Do you think that he does need more discipline now in the way that you felt was needed during the campaign?
Doesn't really matter what I think. The truth is, I left the campaign but never stopped being a Trump supporter or cheerleader for a couple reasons. One, my book, The Clintons' War on Women, was about to publish, and I didn't want anyone to say, oh, that's a Trump project or a Trump-funded project or a Trump-directed project, because it wasn't. Secondarily, and I was wrong about this, I wanted him to run a more traditional campaign in terms of the traditional tools of campaigning, polling, analytics, paid advertising, and so on. He eschewed all those things. I didn't think you could win doing that. He was right. I was wrong. He's a phenomena unto himself. I'm not sure it would work for any other candidate, but it did work for Donald Trump.
Well, in your book, you describe him as using that unconventional approach to have this unprecedented victory. And as you said, it was different than the approach you were talking about. Can you talk about in your book and how you describe how he was able to overcome not having a traditional approach, yet still winning in these states that Republicans haven't been able to win, and where he didn't spend the same amount of money as the Democrats or even the Republican machine when he was running in the primary? In your estimation, how was it that he was able to get around the need for all those traditional approaches?
This election was different than any other presidential election I've been involved in, and this would be my 10th presidential campaign. This was the election in which the tipping point was finally reached in terms of the mainstream media losing their monopoly on the dissemination of political information. Obviously, in the 60s, when there was only 3 networks, the destruction of Barry Goldwater was pretty easy. All 3 networks chimed in, and good old Barry was done. A warmonger, a maniac, a lunatic. Of course, later when he gets back to the Senate, he becomes quite revered. In this election, the tipping point had been reached largely, I think, because of technological reasons, meaning people now getting their news on their handheld device, no longer getting it from a television set. And therefore, the mainstream media, the 3 networks, the 2 cable networks, really lost their oomph. Their ratings start to drop, and more voters are getting their information from alternative sources. Some of them conservative alternative sources, some of them just alternative sources. So yes, Infowars.com, Breitbart, Daily Caller, Town Hall, those are all important, and Trump, I think, realizes this when nobody else does. The other key factor is, for the first time ever, I think voters begin to realize that big media is in bed with big government and the big establishment, that the 3 networks and the 2 cable outlets are reinforcing the narrative of the mainstream media, and voters for the first time are skeptical. Used to be, if you saw something on TV, it must be true. Now I think the opposite is true. You see something on CNN and you wonder why. I wonder if that's really true. So I think those 2 changes, one of them technologically driven, made the big difference for Donald Trump.
So you look at the situation now where he's having poll numbers that are showing him with a lower approval rating. Again, you have the saturation by the media that's, I think, pretty overwhelmingly negative about President Trump so far. Do you think that still the media is having a pretty big impact on his presidency right now, despite his ability to reach out to people through these other avenues?
Well, of course, a lot of the polls that show him with a low approval rating are the same exact polls that showed Hillary Clinton winning easily. So their sample is questionable. One of the problems in this campaign has been the polls across the board were largely wrong. Some of them, I think, through an honest mistake, others because they were padded. In other words, they're based on an assumption that the turnout this past presidential election was going to be identical to 4 years ago. The same number of blacks and whites and Christians and Jews and women and men and younger and older and so on. That was a false premise. There was an assumption that Hillary Clinton would both pull out the same number of African Americans and get the same percentage of them that Barack Obama got. Not possible. So this explains why the polls were so off. There was anecdotal information to the contrary. Look at the crowds Trump was drawing. Now look at the crowds Hillary was having trouble drawing. Look at the overwhelming presence of Trump supporters in social media. The media tended to discount all that, counting on the pollsters. So perhaps the president's approval rating is higher today than some of the polls are showing. On the other hand, the negative barrage does continue, and it's incumbent on the president, frankly, to out-communicate his critics. He still has the bully pulpit, and he can still do that.
Can you talk about your early introduction to President Trump? And you talk about in the book how you saw him as potentially becoming the president someday a very long time ago. Can you talk about what happened there and where you got that feeling?
The first person to imagine a Trump presidency was not me, but was former President Richard Nixon. I was working for Nixon, doing political chores in his post-presidential years, and he met Donald Trump in George Steinbrenner's box at Yankee Stadium. And they hit it off. And he called me the next day and he said, "Well, I met your man. I got to tell you, he's got it. He could really go all the way."
Wow, he said that?
And then days later, he dropped a note, which I reproduce in the book, to Donald Trump that said, this is so typical of Nixon's circumlocution. "Mrs. Nixon," he said, "saw you on the Mike Douglas show and thought you were superb. And she says if you ever run for public office, you will win because you're a winner." And Mrs. Nixon knows about these things. Well, of course, he was talking about himself in his own judgment. Not long after that, President Nixon and Donald Trump spent a weekend together. They went for a charitable event in Houston, Texas. They essentially barricaded themselves in a hotel suite and spent hours together talking geopolitics. And Nixon said Trump just fired questions at him, one after another, wanting to know about Brezhnev, about the Russians, the Chinese, really a around-the-world tour. So the men hit it off, and it was Nixon who first saw the potential for a Trump presidency. I wanted him to run as early as 1988. I was the chairman of his Presidential Exploratory Committee in 2000. I was a consultant to his exploratory effort in 2012. But in retrospect, 2016 was the right year.
Why is that?
Well, I think it was the perfect storm. I think it was not only the tipping point had been reached for alternative media, as we discussed, and that's an important factor, but also after 8 years of Barack Obama, the American people were really ready for something different. In the 40 years I've been involved in politics, I've never seen the voters in this angry or this sour or this disillusioned mood. They're just totally fed up with politicians, political institutions, big media, big government. They're ready for something radical, ready for an outsider, and Donald Trump fit the bill perfectly.
Did he discuss with you his plans to run this time around before he made the decision, or how he was trying to weigh whether to do it or not?
Yeah, actually, within days of Mitt Romney losing, but before the end of 2012, Donald Trump had his attorneys go to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and trademark the slogan, "Make America Great Again." He told me on New Year's Day of 2013 that he was definitely running in 2016 and that he had taken these steps at the trademark office. I was certain that he would run throughout the entire year, and therefore the media columnists like McKay Coppins, for example, and others, this constant hectoring that Trump will never really run, he's just burnishing the brand, this is a publicity, he's a publicity hound, this is a head fake. I knew through the entire year that he would really run.
What was different this year, though? Because he has thought about it before, not carried through.
I think his business was in the right place. He was in the position to turn over his business to his older children. I don't think there were any more mountains to climb in the real estate industry. He'd really kind of done it all, with the hotel now in Washington, D.C. being a new crown jewel in the Trump enterprises. He realized that the country was also in the right place. I would go back to something he told Oprah Winfrey 20 years ago when she said, "Donald, do you think you'd ever run for public office? Would you ever run for president?" And he said, "No, I don't think so, unless things get so bad that I have no choice."
I remember that interview.
That's where we are today. He's not running because he wants the title. He's not running because of the great house and the great plane you get. He's already got a great place in Manhattan and a great place in Palm Beach. He's already got an airplane that's on a par with Air Force One. He's not doing this to be somebody. He already was somebody when he ran for president. He's doing it because the country is in trouble and he thinks he can save it.
What do you make of the response to his presidency by the people who do not support him? The protests have trickled down even to the local level for state representatives who are not Democrat. What do you make of the response, the big protest that took place right after the inauguration? And what does that mean for his success as a president? Is there a way they can just permanently hobble him by just trying to obstruct at every turn, or should they have a greater voice because the popular vote went to Hillary Clinton? What do you make of it?
Well, some of the demonstrations, of course, are agitprop. They're paid for and orchestrated. Others, I think, are sincere people who have concerns because they may be buying the caricature of him that has been painted by some in the mainstream media. The real answer for him is pretty simple, and that is, you know, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Fulfill your agenda. If he restores our nation's economic prosperity, or at least moves in that direction, you see an uptick in jobs. You've already seen the uptick in the market. You've already seen the uptick in small business confidence. But if he restores the economy, I think a lot of this will fall away. A vibrant economy would give him the revenues he needs to address all of our other problems, focusing particularly on infrastructure. Trump is first and foremost a builder, which is why don't try to convince him the wall can't be built, because it can. Don't try to convince him that our inner cities can't be rebuilt. They can. If he will fulfill those promises, I think a lot of this opposition will fall away.
It's a tough wish list, though, because you need the cooperation of Congress, where you have a lot of Republicans who are deficit hawks and don't want to run up a big tab on all these projects, which are going to be very expensive. They've also got health care reform, tax reform. two major agenda items that you normally don't see happen even in a single Congress, never mind two big items like that. So he's promised a lot to the country. Do you think that he can deliver, and is there any hazard for him having promised so much and then perhaps not being able to check off every item?
Well, this is precisely why he's using the executive orders to achieve as much as he can before turning to a legislative solution. His ability to circumvent the Congress and go directly to the people, I think, is unprecedented since Ronald Reagan did exactly that with the Democratic Congress, but passing his initial tax reform. I do think the president should focus on tax reform, particularly his corporate tax cut, his across-the-board tax cut, his program for inversion. I would do that first rather than dealing with immigration first, because I think that is the key to the solution of all the other problems. He's going to have a tough road because, as you point out, some Republicans in Congress are intransient, but his ability to make them feel the heat, if he can't make them see the light by going right to the people, I think is still his whole card.
Let's talk about the book and how you came up with the idea for it, the timing of it. It sounds like you had to write it pretty quickly. When did you first decide that there was going to be a book about his election? Well,
I decided to write a book at the time I left the campaign, because whether or not he won or whether he lost, there was a book in this. Frankly, I was pretty confident that he would win through most of the campaign, even in the darkest days, because I noticed his resilience in the polls. In other words, let's take, for example, his attack on Senator McCain. When many in the mainstream media thought that was it, he was going to be blown out of the race. Sure, he went down 2 or 3 points, and he bounced right back up. Same thing happened when he attacked the judge who was of Mexican-American heritage. Right. He took a small hit in the polls, but he bounced right back. I think that's because voters had bigger issues in mind. And they were going to excuse him these detours, if you will, because of his overall agenda. So I think that resilience always indicated to me that he could win a close race. I did think he had to expand the map, and that opportunity came late, but it came. The ability to go into Michigan and Wisconsin and double down in Western Pennsylvania was where he won this race. I'd go a step further. He got approximately 3% more of the African American vote than Mitt Romney. Doesn't sound like much, sounds de minimis, but it's the difference between winning and losing Michigan.
She also got less, Hillary Clinton.
She got less. The overall turnout was not as great, and he got 3% more. That's the difference between victory and defeat in Michigan. That's the difference between victory and defeat in Wisconsin. And that's the difference between victory and defeat in Pennsylvania. Just that small incremental bump up in the African American vote. So you're in a situation where the race was so close, you can't point to any one thing that made the difference because it was so close. It was a confluence of things that made the difference, including his superhuman physical effort in the close. I mean, stealing a page from Harry Truman, he barnstorms into 8 states late, while Hillary Clinton is back in Chappaqua in her pajamas looking at the swatches for fabric for the new curtains in the Oval Office.
They were very confident, the Hillary Clinton campaign, that they had a victory in front of them, and there were a lot of people in the media, people in Congress, people, political observers, pollsters who felt the same way. You are among a few who felt confident that he would win. Talk about when you really felt that the tide had turned for him right before the election.
Well, prior to the FBI director announcing that he would reopen the inquiry into Hillary's emails, which I think was the Thursday before the election, he was already gaining at a pretty fast clip. That event merely accelerated his climb. In the beginning, she was sitting still in the polls that I was tracking, but after that, she began to drop slightly. That's where you could see the trajectory. So at the close of any race, when you're examining the polls, it's not where you are that it's important as much as the direction. So for example, if Wednesday in Pennsylvania you're down 5, and Friday you're down 3, and Sunday you're down 1, you can see the direction and the trajectory. all of the polling that I examined the final weekend, which came not only from the campaign, some, but the campaign did not spend extensively on polling, whereas Hillary Clinton polled every time she burped. They had to test that burp before we did it. But looking at polling from the state Republican operations, looking from statewide candidates who were polling the presidential question, looking at an enormous amount of data, became clear to me on Sunday before the election. His timing
2
was
days before,
almost perfect.
Okay.
His trajectory was almost perfect, and he was on a track to win. I became confident at that point.
Nobody was expecting, though, the victories in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. Those three were really considered outliers for him to be able to pull off. Were you surprised, though, that he was able to get those three states?
No, because you could see in the polling that they were within reach. You could see that he was gaining. But also, he visited all three. I mean, he went back and visited all three in the close, where I think Hillary and her folks must have thought this was in the bag.
And there were people who thought that he should have been in Ohio, that he shouldn't have been trying to expand the map. He should have been focusing on the must-win states. What happened at that level for them to decide to go ahead and expand rather than just focus on the areas where he really needed to win, but eventually won, like Florida and Ohio? I
think a decision was made that they were both safe, and that turned out to be right. Ohio particularly is interesting because Mitt Romney and John McCain, and for that matter George W. Bush, spent tens of millions of dollars and put forward a very strong effort, and none of them could ever pop Ohio. But that's largely because in the western part of the state, Donald Trump was able to pick up white, moderate, working class union Democrats at a rate that neither of those gentlemen, any of those gentlemen, had been able to achieve. So Trump pulled out to about a 5-point lead in Ohio, and it never dropped. Ohio was safe for him much earlier. It really didn't, in the end, wasn't a battleground state. Florida was tighter, but I think a good decision was made that Donald Trump would carry both, and therefore he could afford to spend his time in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, which was absolutely necessary. He could have carried Ohio and Florida and still lost without those. And of course, Virginia, I think, was always winnable. I think the Republican National Committee pulled crucial resources out of there at the end, which was detrimental. He could have won Virginia, which of course he lost very narrowly.
You break the book down into various sections of the campaign, first the primary and then the general election, and you talk about it requiring sort of two sets of staff for each, depending on what the goal they wanted to achieve. So that's a little bit different, have that sort of transition from primary to general election. And you saw one top campaign staffer leave and another one come in. Can you talk about how that worked? And it was a little bit unusual, and it certainly worked in his favor.
Well, Donald Trump decided on a all communications-based strategy early on, in which the rally was the centerpiece. So he made a decision, rather than spending money on paid media, he would do every interview he could possibly jam into his schedule, and he would go into the states, do these massive rallies, confident that the two cable networks would cover them wall to wall.
And they did.
It's a multi-million-dollar campaign commercial, if you think about it. He did this eschewing organization and structure, and of course, while his primary opponents were spending a fortune on analytics and phone banks and polling and organization, Trump was going solely communications. And it worked. He so completely dominated the free media before each primary that it was like having paid advertising. And that worked fine for that portion of the campaign. When he hit Wisconsin and then subsequently lost delegate contests in North Dakota, Colorado, and Louisiana was stolen out from under him.
Too, right? That's different format, slightly different format.
And you were heading into a convention. Now, in a convention, there's a premium on organization and structure. So, for example, no one in the Trump campaign had thought about who from each state was going to sit on the Rules and the Credentials Committee, which are crucial. If the nomination was going to be stolen from Trump, that's where it would happen. That's why I thought he was wise to bring in my former partner, Paul Manafort, who's an expert in convention politics, pull together a structure, ultimately rout the Cruz people in the Rules Committee, We were prepared to route them in the Credentials Committee.
That's Senator Ted Cruz, who ran against Trump in the primary.
Last man standing. So the campaign needed to change at that juncture, and then it did. Then in a general election, the campaign needed to change again. The president wisely brought in Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, and I think that they were able to retool in time for a general election campaign. But that said, I can tell you, Donald Trump didn't prepare for any of these debates, not in the traditional way, with a stand-in acting like Hillary Clinton.
What did he do?
He didn't do anything. He just read and made notes and calculated, and he went in, and I would argue he won every debate.
But there's lots of criticism about his performance, that he did not seem prepared or knowledgeable about some of the issues.
He's a polarizing figure. There's always going to be criticism. The proof is in the pudding. He won the election. I thought one debate you could argue was a standoff. The others...
Which one was that? Which debate?
I think it was probably the first one. The second one, frankly, he clinched the debate when she said, we can't trust a man like Donald Trump to run the Justice Department. And he said, because you'd be in jail.
That was it.
That was it. That was the beginning of the end.
Well, nowadays the criticism of Trump again is that he's an outsider and he doesn't understand the issues because he's never been in government before. People are saying, well, look, now you've got an outsider here. He's doing all these things that maybe not be good for the country because he doesn't understand. What do you make of that criticism? And do you think Trump really can learn on his feet in the White House?
Well, that's very typical of the Washington establishment. It's like, Mr. President, now that you're here, you have no experience in these things. Let us help you. What they really mean is, let us derail your program. The Republicans and the Democrats, the elite leadership of both parties, they like the status quo. They like the way things are right now. They fight on television, then they all go out to dinner afterwards and slap each other on the back. It's all about getting reelected and raising the money to get reelected. My real problem with the Bush-Clinton, Bush-Obama continuum is not only have they driven the country into the gutter, not only had they given us endless war and massive debt and spending, erosion of our civil liberties, an immigration system that leaves our neighborhoods unsafe, trade agreements that suck the jobs out of the country, and an incoherent foreign policy, but they and their cronies have gotten extremely rich while doing it. So while they have made the people poorer and less safe, they themselves have made hundreds of millions of dollars. It's an elitist phenomenon that I think the voters are fed up with.
Well, yeah, Trump is receiving a lot of criticism about whether there could be conflicts of interest for him because he is supposed to be hands-off with his real estate empire, but there's questions about that. How do you think that will play out? Do you think that the public may start to scrutinize him in a different way and think, well, wait, is he, is there a conflict of interest here, or do you don't see any problem there with him not selling everything?
I actually think one of his greatest strengths in this election was his independence. The fact that people felt he had so much money that you couldn't buy him. There was no use even trying. That he couldn't be bought and he couldn't be bullied. I think that's still the case. I'm satisfied with the way he's structured his business. I think people are going to be hard put to find any actual conflict. He, I'm sure, understands that after he leaves office, he'll have many opportunities if he wants to make more money, but he's a billionaire. How much more money does he need? The important thing is, with that comes the independence to do some very difficult, controversial things. People who talk about his reelection, I think, I don't see that as a foregone conclusion. He may choose not to run. Depends on how much he achieves in 4 years and how much is left to be achieved.
What do you think would influence his decision?
To not run? A bountiful economy, the return of prosperity.
But that's a success in winning when you want to keep doing that.
It may take 8 years. It may take 4, but he's a man of action. He is not going to sit back and let somebody else set this agenda. He's going to set the agenda. I think he'll decide about re-election based on how much he's gotten done and how much more he has yet to do. He's given up an incredible lifestyle to do this. I mean, here's a guy who loves his family, loves his grandchildren. He is really a homebody, even when he's in New York or Florida. He's not out on the party circuit. He loves to play golf. He loves his daily routine. There's a huge sacrifice in this for him, just in terms of lifestyle. He's doing it, again, not because he needs to be somebody, not because it salves his ego, but because he has an agenda to save the country.
One of the hardest parts for transition is to take your campaign and then transition into a presidential team. He brought along with him Steve Bannon, who you talk about in the book as someone who was needed to come in for the home stretch of the general election and to keep Trump focused and centered. Yet now Bannon is sort of criticized and ridiculed by, on Saturday Night Live. They depict him as the Grim Reaper, that he's some, outlier force there in the White House that shouldn't be there. What do you make of that criticism, and how does that square with what you know about Steve Bannon?
First of all, I think the idea that Bannon is Trump's brain or Trump's Svengali is exactly backwards.
Really, and that's because you've known him a long time, and so how does
Steve Bannon and Donald Trump have the same worldview, that they are copacetic on issues, is not surprising. That's how they became friends. That's how they were attracted to each other. So Trump is not doing Bannon's will. Bannon is doing Trump's will. He's doing the president's will. They haven't done anything that the president hasn't talked about in the campaign. Reince Priebus, on the other hand, represents establishment Republicans. I am disgusted by the leaks coming out of the White House. I mean, I understand leaking. I've done a fair amount of it in my day, strategic leaking for a purpose. But when you are leaking to the detriment of your boss, when you are leaking, for example, the Washington Post had a leak in which a White House staffer says the president is like a clueless child. And the New York Times had a leak that talked about the president wearing a bathrobe in the family quarters after hours, which I would hope so, because it's pretty drafty. That's not helping the boss. That's trying to aggrandize yourself by leaking and suck up to reporters.
Who do you think's leaking the
I think it comes out of those who are not Trump loyalists. I tell you this, they're not coming from Steve Bannon or Kellyanne Conway, because they are Trump loyalists. So I fear these leaks come from the establishment Republicans, who seem to dominate most of the White House staff under Reince Priebus. And they're detrimental, they're unprofessional, and they're hurting the president. It's not good.
What do you think is going to happen, though? Because he's going to have to work with establishment people in the White House with him. I mean, they could just undercut his entire presidency then with leaks and just lack of cooperation. What do you think needs to happen?
The best possible reason to hire Trump people for key positions, people whose loyalty is to Donald Trump, people who supported Donald Trump for the nomination prior to the convention, not after. There are many, many qualified people who were active in this campaign who have applied and heard nothing, being this enormous rush to hire Republican National Committee alum. I think it's a mistake. It is interesting to me that when Jim Baker, who was George Bush's campaign manager, was hired to be President Reagan's chief of staff, the first thing he did was reach out to high-profile Reaganites like Lynn Nofziger and Faith Whittlesey and others and hire them for the White House staff, and therefore he didn't brook the kind of criticism that you have now of Mr. Priebus.
So you've worked for other presidents, including Richard Nixon. Could you talk about the two, and if there's any, you said that they spoke at one point while he was living. Can you talk about any comparisons between the two and how they operate? It's pretty early days in Trump's presidency, but are there any similarities or differences you can talk about?
I think there's enormous similarities between both President Trump and President Nixon, and President Trump and President Reagan. They're different. In the case of Nixon, both men are brilliant. Both men are stubborn. When they focus on a goal, you can't get them off of it. Both of them are pragmatic. Trump is not an ideologue. He is a conservative populist, or a populist with conservative instincts. But above all, he's interested in what works. He's interested in solutions, kind of like Franklin Roosevelt. I think he may try something, and if it doesn't work, he'll stop and try something else until he solves the problem. So I think they're both pragmatists, and they're both realists. On the other hand, Trump is very much like Reagan in terms of his size. I don't mean just his physical size, although they have that in common, both tall and broad-shouldered, but there's a command presence there. It's more than charisma, it's more than magnetism, but both men fill a room. They have a certain stature that is particularly strong on television. So in that sense, I think Trump is a master communicator, as Reagan was. Trump is more interested in the details than President Reagan was. In that sense, he's more like Nixon. So I like to think that he embodies the best qualities of both.
That's very interesting. So if you were to make a call on his performance right now, what would you recommend to him in terms of if you were on staff, about what changes you would make, or what you would like to see him do differently?
Well, stick to the agenda, which he's already doing, not different. Hire more Trumpites. I think that is important.
Talk about that.
Invest your confidence in people who share your vision. Don't hire people who have a great resume but have never stood up for Trumpism and weren't for you in the general election. I think that's generally good advice. And ignore the carping of the Washington press corps. They're never going to get with the program. They're still in shock about losing the election. And don't forget the alternative media. In other words, if you want to reach millions of people unfiltered, interview with Breitbart, interview with the Daily Caller, interview with InfoWars. They're reaching millions and millions of people, and you're not going to get the twist that you'll get from, say, CNN.
Should he try to reach out to the people who voted for Hillary Clinton because she did win the popular vote? Is there some way he should try to reach out to the people?
The best way to reach out to them is to revitalize our economy and prove your critics wrong. Something that Trump said throughout this campaign, where he would say, in a year, you'll see, you'll be really happy, I'm going to do a good job. I think that's true. I think that he will get a reassessment after a year. So ignore the carping, ignore the petty criticism, and stick to your agenda. And remember, if you revive the economy, if you renegotiate the trade deals, if you start to rebuild our inner cities, just take one city as an example, take Detroit or Philadelphia and show what can be done. I think he could be one of our greatest presidents.
Does he have the skills to take his business acumen and then translate it into working in government? Such a different skill set, you would argue, I suppose. Do you think he has the ability to do that? He's been a businessman his whole life. The machinations of Washington, it's much different, having to work with Congress. There's lots of roadblocks and frustrations. You could say, well, geez, you need to be a talent like LBJ to be able to work with the Congress these days. Everybody's so angry at each other, right? Yet he has none of that experience. Do you see him being able to do that? Yes, because he's a deal maker. He's a negotiator. And you never know how much of what he says is for the purposes of negotiation. So, for example, he's talked about tariffs on our trading partners. I'm not sure he's really going to do tariffs, but I'm also not sure that he's not. It's the stick, now the carrot. So either we make a better deal or I'll be forced to do tariffs. He's doing that so far with various things. But he knows that the cut in the corporate tax rate would cripple China and Mexico faster than any tariff, which is why he needs to put it in forefront of his program. The way he has worked the phone on Carrier, for example, and other big companies to induce them to stay here, it's really worthy of Lyndon Johnson. He really has been jawboning these executives to get them to stay and expand. I think you're going to see more of that. Now, you can argue, oh, it's only 1,000 jobs here and 1,000 jobs there. It's symbolic that he's making the effort, I think, is what's important. One of the more interesting parts of your book is where you talk about him as an underestimated candidate. I mean, that was, I guess you could say that's the understatement of the year. He was such an underestimated candidate. How did he stay confident? That I was always amazed by how confident he remained, even though, you know, you're right, the Washington media establishment, his own party, everybody seemed dead set against him being the nominee, and then dead set against him being the president. I mean, he just seems like an almost impossibly confident person. Did you notice that about him, and how do you think that played into his victory? Well, he's an optimist. And he is supremely confident. I think that's one of the things that appealed to voters. He is a can-do guy. He doesn't think that anything is impossible. He never thought that this election was impossible. Even he, at the end, I think, finally got beat down by the constant
mainstream media saying, you can't win, you can't win, you can't
Really?
win. Well, he told his wife, as he said publicly, baby, we may not win tonight. That's about as bad as it got. And I think it was momentary. Nobody could be immune to the fact that the mainstream media tried to write him out of the race at least 3 times. At the end of August, they were saying his victory was impossible. We hadn't even had a campaign yet. So I don't think he ever lost the faith. I always thought that he thought he would win. His confidence is integral to the makeup of his personality. That's what makes him Donald Trump.
Well, where does it come from? You know, that's pretty unusual to be that confident.
Well, I think 2 things. First of all, he has succeeded beyond his own wildest dreams in terms of building an economic success, a business success, but also the experience of coming to the brink of disaster and fighting your way back. That makes you stronger. Trump is a very, very tough guy.
What phase were you talking about that, the brink of disaster?
His bankruptcy,
right.
Or take it back, his near bankruptcy. He never filed for personal bankruptcy.
Right.
He used bankruptcy as a legitimate tool for his companies, and of course they emerged from bankruptcy. So he got overextended. There was a crash. He survived it. Not only did he survive it, he came back stronger than ever.
1987?
Yes, roughly. This is very much like, say, Richard Nixon and Watergate.
Right.
His career is in tatters, but he claws his way back to respectability, and he ends up as an advisor to President Clinton on matters of foreign policy that, you know, are vexing the country, Russia, China,
Right.
and so on.
Sure.
So that near-death experience makes you tougher. Anybody who doesn't understand how tough Donald Trump is really doesn't get it. In his personal demeanor, he's very likable. He's a regular guy. He's not snobby or stilted or stiff or formal in any way. So he's a billionaire who's not an elitist, who's not a snob. But I think that experience of coming close to financial disaster and surviving it has just made him stronger and more confident.
You talk about in your book, your relationship goes back decades. Can you talk about your first meeting with him and what your impression was when you first met President Trump?
Sure. I went to New York in 1979. I was assigned to run New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut for former Governor Ronald Reagan's campaign. I was introduced to Donald Trump by his attorney, the notorious Roy Cohn. I went and saw Cohn, and I told him, you know, I needed a headquarters, a finance committee, volunteers, telephones, and so on. And he said, what you need is Donald Trump. Now, I'll make an appointment for you with Donald Trump, but he's very busy. He's not going to give you much of his time, so make your pitch and get out. So I went to see Donald. He was very gracious. I said, Mr. Trump, it's a great honor to meet you. He said, please call me Donald. After the inauguration, when I said, congratulations, Mr. President, he said, please call me Donald. He's an unassuming guy. He's just eminently likable. He has a great sense of humor. He's very funny. But what impressed me that day was his intensity. He listened to everything I had to say, and then he asked 4 or 5 very tough questions. And his questions, and remember, I'm making the pitch that Ronald Reagan can get elected president, 1979. All of his questions related to the electoral map. First question he asked me was, how do you get to 270? It's interesting. I'm assuming your man can carry California, which of course he did, but how does he get to 270? Interestingly, in virtually every conversation I had with him about the 1980 presidential campaign, and he's a junkie, he loves politics the way he loves sports, he would always ask that same question at the end. So give me your new take on the map. Where's your 270? So he's always understood that construct. And I think it was a key part of the strategy for this campaign. He always had an eye on how to get to 270 electoral votes.
His politics have been less concrete, though. He is considered at some phases in his life to be a Democratic supporter now. I mean, what are his politics? I think people still wonder where he is firmly planted politically, if anywhere.
Well, prior to his political activism, when he was a businessman and strictly a businessman, he gave to both parties. And he gave to candidates from both parties.
Not uncommon. Many business people
very
do that.
Common, particularly for people of his wealth and with a company as large and with as many interests. New York City is a Democratic bastion.
Right.
One has to have great relationships with the unions in order to build anything in New York City.
He's actually got a lot of union support, too.
He's been always had a great relationship with the building trades unions. He did leave the Republican Party largely because he objected to the Iraq War, and he was deeply disappointed in George W. Bush. And I was there in those days. He most definitely opposed the Iraq War because I was opposed to it, and we talked about it, and I wrote that at the time. He came back to the Republican Party after George W. Bush was gone. He did briefly switch to the Reform Party, or actually the Independence Party of New York, which is affiliated with the Reform Party, because Ross Perot and then Governor Jesse Ventura urged him to look very seriously at the Reform Party nomination. It's important to note that the Reform Party was entitled to $58 million worth of matching funds at the time, something they're no longer entitled to because of the strong showings of Ross Perot in 92 and 96. So you had the prospect of running for president on OPM, other people's money. That appealed to Trump the businessman, as you might expect, but he correctly concluded after a really intense explanation that the country's not going to elect an independent president anytime soon. That just ballot access is controlled by the Republicans and the Democrats working together, and therefore one really has to be a Republican or a Democrat to win the election as president. He switched back to the party of his parents and the party that he spent most of his adult life in, the Republican Party.
Talk about a little bit of the tensions within the campaign. This was some dramatic moments early in the campaign between Paul Manafort, who was the phase 2 campaign person who came in, and Corey Lewandowski. He was the phase 1 person who was there orchestrating the big campaign rallies that really launched Trump into the stratosphere as a candidate. And how did Manafort, how was he able to transform, as what you described, sort of an unruly campaign into something that had a lot more discipline? And how did he carry that out so quickly? And do you think it was, you know, successful in your estimation? I know he did win, but there were certainly stumbles along the way there in the second part of the campaign.
Well, Corey Lewandowski is an advanced man. And for that period of the campaign, that's what was called for. Paul Manafort was able to call on a deep bench of political associates going back through many presidential campaigns to lend a hand, people with more experience at the state level. He was able to pull the very best out of the existing Trump organization to whip together an organization going into the convention to surmount the challenges there. It's a substantial task, but the successful nomination of Trump, quashing the Ted Cruz forces in the Rules Committee in their attempt to try to hijack the nomination, demonstrated that he was successful. Also, I think, though, the convention has to be viewed as what it really is, a television show. It's about entertainment. And Paul Manafort helped Donald Trump stage a very successful convention. The highlighting of the Trump children, the terrific speech to rally the faithful by Rudy Giuliani, General Flynn's speech. There are a lot of high points in this convention. We have a larger audience for our convention than the Democrats, unheard of. They pulled it out, they pulled it together very quickly without much structure. So Manafort, I think, gets and deserves and gets a lot of credit in the book.
That's around the time that you departed the campaign. Can you talk about that a little bit and what led to your leaving?
Well, I left in August because my book on the Clintons was coming out, and I didn't want Trump to be accused of being the secret, progenitor of that, because he wasn't. Because I had a fundamental disagreement on campaign strategy at the time.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Or what's your...
Well, I mean, I think I've already addressed it. I think he needed to run a more traditional campaign, and I did think that some of the Twitter fights that he got in distracted from his overall message of immigration and tax reform and trade and so on. Again, he was right and I was wrong about a lot of it. But I also appointed myself as the #1 surrogate for Donald Trump. I probably did 500-600 interviews or surrogate speeches between the time I left and Election Day, because I felt I knew the man for almost 40 years, and I could tell people firsthand why he would be a great president, why I was for him, about his independence, about his resilience, about his toughness. So I never stopped being a Donald Trump supporter, but at 64 years old, I wasn't going to be in a campaign structure in which I had to approve what I was going to write or say. I felt I could be of greater help from the outside, and I think I was.
During the convention, there was a dramatic moment when Senator Cruz did not endorse Trump on the stage. He just told the voters, the delegates, to vote their instinct or their conscience instead of voting for Trump. What was his response to that, and was that a surprise to you?
I think it was a surprise to everyone in the campaign, because Paul Manafort had made it clear to Senator Cruz and to Jeff Rowe, his manager, that he didn't have to use the word endorse, but he had to say that he was supporting Donald Trump and the ticket. This was, I think, one of the great misreadings of politics. If Senator Cruz thought that Trump was going to lose, and he clearly did, the smart thing to do would have been to do what Richard Nixon did in 1964 when he was certain that Goldwater would lose. Give him a full-throated endorsement and campaign for him every place. That way, if Trump lost, people would say, good old Ted Cruz, man, he was really there for the party. He broke his back for the ticket. He gets consideration next time. Instead, Ted Cruz decided to be Nelson Rockefeller, take his ball and go home. Hardcore conservatives and Trump supporters will never let him be the nominee of the party, because he turned his back on the party when the prospects didn't look good. Now, later on, when he figures out that Trump is likely to win, he endorses Trump. Too little, too late, Senator. So I think he made an enormous mistake. I guess he thought that the quality of his rhetoric would be so great that it would be like the 1976 moment when Ronald Reagan addressed the convention after Ford's nomination, and it was true. Many people in that convention hall said, my God, we have nominated the wrong man. He's not Ronald Reagan. In fact, he's more like Richard Nixon than Ronald Reagan.
What was Trump's response? Was he surprised by that, hurt by it, angry? Did he have any response?
I think he was unhappy, but he was later on, I think, quite generous towards the senator, and I think he accepted his later endorsement with good grace.
The two had gone back and forth and traded insults. There was Trump's declaration that Ted Cruz's father had been in conversations with the Kennedy assassin, and you write a little bit about that in your book. What do you make of that? Some people would say, well, why are we talking about this? It's not relevant. It's not, but you make it part of your book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I believe that Senator Cruz's father did in fact know Lee Harvey Oswald. Judith Very Baker, who is indisputably an associate of Oswald, writes this in her book. She said it in multiple interviews. The photograph you've seen comes from the Warren Commission, not from the National Enquirer. I think Donald Trump threw it out there to get under Ted Cruz's skin and make him erupt. That was
Is that fair, though?
That
I
was
mean, it
highly
questions
acceptable.
his patriotism when, in fact,
It wasn't questioning his patriotism. Was questioning his temperament.
Interesting.
Look, the question is obvious. Why do people take an instantaneous dislike to Ted Cruz? They're merely saving time.
So you feel like Trump's tactics of trying to get an emotional rise out of people on Twitter, should he do that now in the White House, or should he back off on that?
Only for a strategic purpose. In this case, he got Ted Cruz so angry he was drooling. You can see him getting into a fight with a 10-year-old boy at a rally. So, and the kid keeps yelling, "Lion Ted, Lion Ted."
But in a way, you could argue it backfired, because Cruz cited that, as well as I think there was some disparaging things said about his wife Heidi as reasons why he was not able to endorse Trump. And we could argue perhaps a Cruz endorsement might have helped Trump at the convention.
Trump won, therefore I think Senator Cruz is the loser in his entire calculation. Look, he's a Bush Republican masquerading as something else. And I call him out very extensively in the book.
You think he'll survive trying to run again in 2018?
I would hope that somebody will challenge him in the Republican primary in Texas, maybe the Attorney General. If not, perhaps Alex Jones will run, who knows, but somebody needs to challenge him. But if he survives that, and he has latent plans to run for president, I think many Republicans are going to remember the fact that he wouldn't endorse the ticket at the convention.
Can you talk about some of your favorite or most relevant passages in the book that you find are, were really important to you, that you want people to take notice of?
Sure. Harry Hurt, in his biography of Donald Trump, and the late Wayne Barrett, who just passed away recently of the Village Voice, have both written that a story that circulated that indicated that Donald Trump was scheduled to fly to Atlantic City from New York in a helicopter that would tragically crash in the Pinelands and kill everybody aboard, that was made up, that Donald Trump never intended to be on that helicopter, that there was no plans, but that he promulgated the story to generate favorable publicity. I can tell you firsthand that they're wrong, BuzzFeed, Harry Hurt, Wayne Barrett, because I was working for Donald Trump as a lobbyist, working on currency transaction issues. I was in Washington, he was in New York. I called him and said I needed to see him as soon as possible to go over some compromise language that needed an approval immediately. And he said, I can't see you today, I've got to go to Atlantic City. I said, I could jump the shuttle and be there in an hour and a half. It's really important. He said, all right, I'll send the helicopter ahead and have it come back and pick me up. I was sitting in his office when Norma Federer, his longtime assistant, came in and told him that the superintendent of state police in New Jersey, Clint Pagano, was on the phone. He put the veteran cop on the speakerphone and he said, Mr. Trump, I have terrible news. The helicopter your company chartered has crashed and there are no survivors. And Donald said, are you absolutely sure? And Pagano said, yes, 100%. And of course, women were crying. It was a horrific time. To his credit, Donald called every one of the widows right then and there, in some cases breaking the news to them, which I could never have done. So Donald Trump was telling the truth. Now, I am not claiming that I saved his life. I really believe that this was an act of divine intervention, that this is bigger than any one person. And at that point, I decided that God had spared Trump for a purpose, some future purpose. We know what that purpose is.
Dramatic, very dramatic.
But Trump was telling the truth about the entire incident, and he was smeared by his critics.
What a story. Roger Stone, thanks for being here. The Making of the President 2016, now available.
Delighted to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Mike. I'm the creator of Mox News. And for the last 15 years, I have been telling you that as long as I have the support of the community that I serve, Mox News will post videos forever. And that's the truth. As long as I have your support, no one can ever make me stop. Unfortunately, currently, Mox News viewers, damn it. Hi everyone, my name's Mike. I'm the creator of Mox News. And for the last 15 years, I have been telling you that as long as I have the support of the community that I serve, Mox News will post videos forever. And that's the truth. As long as I have your support, no one could ever make me stop. Unfortunately, currently, less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of Mox News viewers ever donate, tip, or contribute anything back. Again, let me make that really clear. Much less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% ever give anything back. And to those of you who have donated to Mox News, I want to thank you so much, because it's because of your generosity that we have been able to bring attention to important videos that millions and millions of eyes would have never seen. And I think that that's an amazing thing that we've been able to make happen together. And I can't thank you enough for helping me make that happen. So it's not too late. If you'd like to see Mox News covering the 2020 presidential election, if you can't imagine the 2020 presidential election without Mox News, please, there's still time. You can make a difference. It's easy to make a contribution, donation, or tip. You can go to moxnews.com, or in the text body of this video, there are clickable links to the Patreon page or to the PayPal page. And again, it should take less than 2 minutes to make a donation, and your donation can make a big difference. So I thank you all. Stay cool. One of these days this war is going to end, and it would be awesome if Mox News could be there to celebrate that day with you.